So I want to talk with you a little bit about service, which you're well versed in it, right? Like
Yeah.
you got it. But for the sake of the whole citizens of Stonecrest, though I know that you are specifically focused in District 3, but for everyone, what does public service mean to you? Public service, what does it mean to you?
So before I answer that directly, let me say that even though I represent District 3, we are in an infancy stage as a city. So truly, we all represent all of Stonecrest. We're not in a mature place where we can truly say there are things that are just unique to one district that no other district has like it. Every service that we provide, every challenge that we're trying to overcome touches every district. So although I do represent the fine folks in District 3, I think that everything that I've done and everything that I will continue to do affects more than just District 3. But yes, public service means to me making sure that what we are responsible for, we are delivering. Whether that's a full service city, whether that's the 3 services that we have today, and whether that's somewhere in between, we are responsible to providing that service to those who are in the public, those who we serve, who look to us for those to receive those services is the definition of public service. So sometimes that's city services, sometimes that's economic development, sometimes that's code enforcement, planning and zoning, and sometimes that's parks and recs. Other times that's making sure that our community has a resource like the food distribution. Sometimes that's making sure that we have a resource center where we can provide a solution to a need. Sometimes it's all of that in one. So public service is truly defined by being able to serve the public in whatever need that is, and whatever you're responsible for delivering, that you do that with the utmost compassion, of course, but also with the utmost integrity as you try to provide those services to your citizens and provide those needs to that. And I think that's a community effort. I don't think that public service is specific to government. I think that there are all kinds of nonprofit entities or community service organizations that also fill that ecosystem of public service. Sometimes folks just say, well, you're the government, you do it, And although there are limitations to what government can and cannot do, it's a community ecosystem that takes care of our community. It's not just the government. So we need those community service organizations that feed the homeless, that provide shelters. We need the organizations that clean up the city or clean up the county or clean up the state. We need all of those services that provide feminine products to those who need it, or diapers and clothes to mothers who are in need. It's a community ecosystem that makes public service. It's really not just a government function. And I think that once we all get on the same page with that, our community will be better for it.
That's good. So in that same vein of public service, what do you see as the primary, necessary, essential characteristics of a public servant, and which of those do you feel that you most exemplify?
Yeah. So again, a public servant doesn't necessarily mean a government official, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'll answer it I'll answer that question as a public servant, but not as a government official, because I do think there are different attributes that you need for one or the other. Some of those attributes cross over for sure, but I think you can be a public servant without being a government official. So one, I think the one word to describe me, passionate. I think you need passion, no matter whether you're on the public service side, exclusive to kind of community activism and nonprofit, or whether you're on the government official side, you need passion. But that passion should also come with compassion. I think we need to be compassionate to what people are going through, what the needs are of our citizens, and what we truly define as important to our community. I think you can play either role if you have those things. But there are some things I think that a government official has to have for sure. And one, that is an acumen for government operations. I think you've got to have an understanding. You have to have that sense of business acumen that gets down to the root of how to achieve these goals of government operations, which is totally different than feeding the hungry, right? There's one goal there: get food to the people who need it, right? No matter what, right? But in government services, there's a dynamic there that you really have to understand. There's a dynamic there that there's an acumen there that you have to be able to correlate how policy provides procedure, how procedure turns into services, how services turn into, you have to understand how that works. You have to be able to process those things to make the best decision that affects your citizens. Planning and zoning is a very good example. That's not something that an everyday person can just grab a hold of that quickly. There's an acumen there you need to be able to understand the building blocks for that, and to be able to use that to make a decision that affects the everyday life of your stakeholder and your constituent. So there are common attributes between a public servant and a government official, but there are most certainly some that are exclusive to one and not the other.
That's good. That was a very complete response. I appreciate that. You talked about constituents and stakeholders. What's the difference?
Typically, in the root of it, there isn't. But kind of in the government operations, service delivery world, a stakeholder is typically your business owner, whether it's commercial or industrial, and then your constituent is your residential. Whether it's a renter or an owner, it's your residence.
Oh, your city. Okay, that's good. So when I think about council, because my family and I have resided in Stonecrest since 2017. We bought our home, and as we bought our home, we thought we were purchasing a home in Lithonia. That's what we thought was happening, and then folk voted on us, and we found ourselves in the city. And and I said, oh, okay. And a friend said, oh, that'll be interesting. I have friends who are residents of Clarkston and Tucker, and they say, oh, let us know what you think about living in a municipality in a city. And I said, what? But it's been interesting. It's been interesting. So when I think about council, and when folks who watch this think about council, I never want to make the assumption that everybody knows the roles and responsibilities of councils, of the council members. I never want to take that for granted, that that's just something everybody knows. So how would you encapsulate the responsibility that council members have to constituents and stakeholders? What is the responsibility that council members have to constituents and stakeholders? And what are the ways, it's a two-part question, and what are the ways that council members are accountable to residents and constituents, or constituents and stakeholders?
It's a good question, because I think there is a common misconception of what the standard role of a council member is, which is also what a state legislator's role is, or a county commissioner. We are the definition of a legislator. We sit in the legislative branch because we are the legislative body. So we create policy, and we use that policy to help provide and deliver services to our constituents. That includes the budget as well, because that is literally a piece of legislation. So we pass resolutions and ordinances. We enforce those policies through code enforcement, planning and zoning, all the services that we deliver those services through policy. So we are the policy makers. That's what legislators do. That's what happens when you're in the legislative branch, which is much different than sitting in a judicial branch or an executive branch. So the roles are very different to create that checks and balance. Now, of course, when they overlap, then you have an issue with checks and balances. But the general idea is to have the different branches separated so that there is separate roles, and so that there are checks and balances. So we are to be accountable to our citizens by understanding, identifying what the need is, constituents and stakeholders, identifying and understanding what that need is, and then making sure that we legislate into a resolution. So for instance, if we have an issue from our constituents and our stakeholders where the zoning for certain parcels are infringing on one another, it is our job to create legislation to solve that problem. It's not to go out there and start shoveling dirt and separating the property lines. It is to create law, policy that provides a resolution or provides a solution to that need. That is what we do. So if, again, another example with the budget, if there's a need for a public works service, it is our job to legislate our way to that solution. How do we get a public work service? Well, we look in the budget. We see where the budget can sustain that cost increase. We make sure we have our research to understand what the tax implication is from what is the millage that we receive now versus what the cost of that service truly is. Where is that gap? How do you fill that gap? We legislate our way to a solution. That's what a legislator's role is. You'll find that on the state level, like I said before, the federal level, you find it on the county level as well. When you are in the legislative branch, that is what you do. Now, I think we take liberties to say we're going to go beyond that. I mean, that's all we're required to do, right? But because you have compassionate people, we go beyond that, right? We say, okay, I'm going to take a step outside of just legislating, and I'm going to do things like clean up my community. I'm going to do things like have food distributions, have town hall meetings where I bring in public safety representatives, where I bring in sanitation and roads. I'm going to go beyond that because there's a need that I want to fill. There's a communication I want to have. There's a relationship I want to build between my constituents and my stakeholders. So I'm going to go beyond what the book says my job is because that's the kind of person that I am. But there's a misconception that that's mandatory. There's a misconception that you're not doing your job if you don't do the things that are outside of that. And that truly is a misconception. If our legislators only worked for a state, for example, if they only worked for 40 days, they've done your job. But many of them, because they are great, they work well beyond 40 days throughout the year. They're doing all kinds of things within their districts to help make sure that their constituents and stakeholders have what they need, that they're taken care of, that that conversation is a back and forth. So that is the role. Again, that role requires a certain acumen in order to be successful at it. But you most certainly, I think, are not, I think that the people will either keep you or remove you from your seat if you're not doing your job plus some. I think you've got to do the plus some and build that relationship and satisfy some of those needs outside of just legislating in order for the people to feel connected to you, to feel like you've heard their concerns and that you're working very hard to solve those concerns. Because believe it or not, many of the concerns we get from our constituents do not necessarily have to do with the services that we provide. And so it takes a different person to say, it's not our role to feed the community, but there's a need there. So we're going to legislate our way to that. We're going to find a way in the budget, which is a piece of legislation, to be able to use funds to feed our community, to clothe our community, to provide any resources that we can to help that need. That is actually beyond what the legislation requires us to do. But I think you have the right people in the right place that do that no matter what.
That's good. It is essential to have the right people in the right place. And I think also really important, because I loved your explanation of the role and what actually is the defined responsibilities as opposed to the added benefits that some people, depending on the people, add in, right? So I'm not going to talk about DeKalb County. I'm not going to talk about the city of Georgia and all those kind of things, but I heard that people sometimes feel challenged and feel at a distance and feel as if their elected officials are not concerned about their quality of life, their concerns and all those kind of things. So it's interesting to me when the disconnection happens, because these people are elected into office by folks. Like, you can't get there without people choosing to place you in there. And then it seems to me to be a disconnect if you were not willing to listen and respond to your constituents and stakeholders once you hold the seat.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing the way you did. I think it's a great transition to our next segment, which is to talk about Stonecrest.